Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where we cover everything D&D, including advice for players and guides for DMs.
We upload new videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and ring the bell up in the corner so that you can be up to date on all of our content.
And a big thank you to all of our patrons for supporting the channel. More details on that at the end of the episode. But for today, we're going to be talking about 10 red flags that you should watch out for when you are looking to join a new Dungeons & Dragons group.
There are lots of new people joining the hobby of Dungeons and Dragons, and there's a lot of people out there looking for groups and trying to find anybody that they can to start a game with. But you should be careful when joining a group to make sure that you are joining the right group for you and that you are getting along with everybody in the group that you're going to be playing with. When we look at these 10 red flags, it is important to note that not a single one of them is by itself a deal breaker. You might experience one or two of these in your group that you've played with for a long time and you guys handle it just fine. But if the list starts to pile up or you are finding that the red flag that you are experiencing is an ongoing issue that is taking away from your enjoyment of the game, then it might be time to look elsewhere. It could be said that playing no D&D at all could be better than playing bad D&D. And so sometimes you need to be aware of the games that you're getting into.
Especially if you are brand new to Dungeons & Dragons, have not played before, and are looking for your very first group to join, these are definitely some red flags that will help you avoid some of those classic RPG horror stories that you hear about a lot. In our minds, there is nothing worse than an excited new player joining a new Dungeons & Dragons group and having a completely avoidable and negative experience from playing a group with people who don't necessarily have that new player's best interests or enjoyment in mind. So with that, let's dive in and look at the very first red flag. And this is kind of the mother of all red flags, I believe. If you join a new D&D group and there is no session zero, no talk of a session zero, or no prognosis of having perhaps a session re-zero to integrate you as a new player into the group, that's probably the biggest single red flag going.
A session zero is where you get the group of players together and you don't dive right into the game. You discuss characters, the world, and the expectations of what the game feels like at your table. The DM usually is going to give some information about what their expectations are, what the players' expectations are, any house rules that they might have, and sort of lay down the groundwork for the vibe and feeling that you're going to have playing D&D with this group of people. For this reason, this is our first red flag, because if you have a session zero or a discussion with the entire table to lay out the expectations, you're actually going to avoid 90% of the other red flags on this list. Or they're going to come up immediately in the session zero and you can say, I don't think this is the group for me. Session zero is like orientation day at school or your first day on the job. You're not expected to dive right in and do everything. They want to get you warmed up and accustomed to the environment and the things that are going to be happening there.
We made a full guide on how to run a session zero in our video right up over here. And I would say that this is such a big red flag that if you join a D&D group and there is no talk of a session zero, you should propose having one.
I also will say that there's this sort of re-zero, the session re-zero, and in a small way, we actually have these a lot.
Yeah.
And it should be open for any player at the table. Jill messaged us the other day and asked if we could have a meeting just to catch back up about where we were in our game of Drakkenheim. So we all got together on a video call and just chatted for an hour about our characters, where we were at, and what the expectations are moving forward. It's really good to have these from time to time, and especially if a new player is joining in.
And just to be 100% clear, an email, a group chat, or a document that is distributed to everybody in some way, shape, or form is not a replacement for a session zero. Session zero can be done face-to-face or it can be done over a video or voice call, but a group chat and an email where everyone is not engaged in the conversation at the same time is not really a substitute for session zero. So that can be one of those things where there's positive intent in trying to have the essence of a session zero, but I really think that it's so important to have that actual dedicated conversation with everyone in the group.
And I think when we're talking about new players joining a game, this does bring us to our second red flag. And that is if you are joining a game that is already in progress, perhaps in mid-tier to high-level play. Now, there are a few stipulations that I want to say with this, because this is actually quite a common thing. I myself, when I was running my first campaign, had 2 players that ended up having to leave my table for personal reasons. I now had only a few players at my table, and we wanted a few more. So I asked some friends that were interested if they wanted to join a game that was already at level 5 or 6. However, we had a session re-0 to help introduce them, and that helped mitigate that. But if you're a brand new player and you show up to D&D and they say, all right, here's the table. We've been playing together for 4 months. We're level 6, and yep, join in with your character. Let's go. And there's no prep work done. You didn't really expect this, or you're trying to scramble to figure out how your character fits into this already ongoing and established group. It can be difficult, and so this might be a red flag for you.
In my undergrad, I joined a D&D group that was playing at, I think, 8th level, and I came in with my character made, and I sat there for the game session waiting for my character to be introduced, and got to the end of the game session, and my character hadn't been introduced to the campaign. So I sat there, and I didn't get to play. And that was awful, and I never came back. And so make sure that if you are in this experience where you are joining in a group that their campaign is in progress, your character should be introduced right away, and you shouldn't have that experience where you're sitting there for an hour waiting for your character to get integrated into the group, into the dynamic. There's a whole bunch of problems that can occur with this process, and in my books, it should be pretty smooth. Like the dungeon master and the player should be able to work creatively to make sure that your character is integrated into the party and you are able to participate in the game right away. And if they're not ready for you yet, then they should add your character at an appropriate point when that would make sense for the narrative, instead of having you wait there for an entire game session not participating at all in what's going on. That's a really miserable experience. And by the same token, I think for new players, I would just say for any new players out there that are looking for groups, I would strongly recommend avoiding groups that have a high-level campaign that's already in progress. I think that it really is good for a first-time player to have that new player experience of playing at lower levels. I know it's not always possible, and I will say I've introduced Kyle to D&D, and he was playing as a 13th level character, and that was his first D&D character. So it can be done. It's just not ideal.
As we move on to our next point, this one is another interesting red flag that may work at your table, it may not work at your table. But for me, a red flag is a dungeon master who has a long list of banned options, character options, spells, everything. If they have a long shopping list of things that they don't allow at their table, this for me is a red flag. I want to be very specific with this. Every dungeon master has the right to say, Aarakocra and turtles don't exist in my setting, or something like, these certain spells I don't allow at my table. Perhaps there's certain character options or classes or features that they generally don't allow. But I find that once this list reaches a certain point, what I found is that this relates to an issue that I have ongoing, where things will come up in the game that I was unaware of, that suddenly the dungeon master is informing me, no, you can't do that. No, I don't allow that. No, that's not how that's going to work. And I have found it very frustrating. I've joined a table where the dungeon master did this. And at first they presented, here's a list of things you can't do. So I tried to build within the scenario that they were presenting, and I still got shut down at almost every opportunity. And I found myself getting constantly shut down with my creativity and the things that I wanted to do to build the character I wanted to play. Now, again, you have to be aware of whether or not you enjoy working within the stipulations that the Dungeon Master's given you. And sometimes you might come presenting a character and the Dungeon Master says, actually, this, and the other thing I'm not really fond of in my games. Can we work together to smooth this out? If the Dungeon Master is open to working with you and there is that sort of camaraderie, then that feels more welcoming. But if you are continually getting shut down by the Dungeon Master pushing back on the options that they will allow, that's where it becomes a major red flag for me.
A laundry list of banned items can really help you diagnose that this might be an issue from the outset. But if you are constantly finding that your creativity is getting shut down by the dungeon master, you're constantly being told no, you're being constantly told that won't work, you're being constantly told you can't do that, those are all ways that the dungeon master is really being authoritarian and controlling over the game. And this can extend beyond just player options. It might just be, no, you are not allowed to play a divination wizard. It might extend into signs that the dungeon master might have tendencies towards railroading aggressively as well, saying to player characters, no, you can't go back to town to get a ladder to climb in the second story of the window because I didn't plan for that, so you have to do it the way that I wanted it to be. Definitely for me, that increases the number of red flags, and that's where I get super, super concerned.
This actually does lend itself to our next point, which is a dungeon master continuing to say no. But in this case, if a dungeon master is shutting down certain play styles and is using terms like metagaming or power building, but specifically they are saying that they will punish players who do this, or that it is not tolerated at their table. Now, there are a number of opinions out there on metagaming and power gaming, but what's difficult is that this has become a massive gray area. A player who knows the rules well and picks optimal choices for their character is not necessarily power gaming or metagaming. It is very possible to play a powerful, well-designed character and still have a great time role-playing and contributing to the game. The reason why this is a red flag for me is because it is unclear what a dungeon master says, I don't allow metagaming or power building at my table, and you will be punished if you do so. It's unclear to me exactly what that means. If I choose Great Weapon Master or Sharpshooter for my character, am I going to be punished or told that I can no longer play at the table? Am I going to get to have a conversation with that DM on why I chose these options? If I'm a Halfling Divination Wizard who takes Lucky and Halfling Luck and all of those abilities to make sure that the dice rolls are working in my favor, am I power gaming? Am I metagaming? Or am I just building a really fun, lucky character who knows how to divine the wisdom of the universe? It's unclear to me where I'm going to be punished, and that doesn't feel right with me.
These two red flags in particular are possible indicators. They're not guarantees, but they're possible indicators of a type of adversarial dungeon master style that often results in a game where the encounters and the storyline has to go along the way the dungeon master planned it, and it signals that you might not have a lot of agency as a player at this dungeon master's table. It can help you avoid those situations where you get into a campaign where it feels like your choices as a player don't matter, and that you're just being dragged around from set piece battle to set piece battle while the dungeon master's NPCs run things along. And I would say that kind of like a sub red flag to add in here is that I definitely think that a dungeon master player character is a huge red flag at this point. If the DM is coming into this with a huge, like a DMPC or a huge cast of super powerful NPCs who are always bossing the players around, telling them what to do, or interfering or solving the players' problems, and that's happening right away from the first session of the game, that's just a huge red flag for me. Like it just really signals a style of DMing that I have no interest in being a player in, and I play the game because I want my character to feel like the hero of the story. I want my character to be able to make interesting choices and do interesting things. If I feel like my character is just going to be a spectator beside the dungeon master's pet NPCs, I'm out.
I will also say that being somebody who has a vast knowledge of Dungeons and Dragons, I love the game. I read all of the content I can about it. It's hard for me sometimes to separate my knowledge from my play, and I do my best. But if Monty throws 3 trolls at me and I drop a fireball on them, am I metagaming because I know that fire is the weakness of trolls? No, not really.
I would say everybody knows about trolls. Everybody knows about vampires. Like, these are just things that we can't consider that metagaming anymore unless you have like a setting where the dungeon master is really trying to say that like nobody in this world knows anything about monsters at all because it's a super low fantasy setting. But even then, even then,
it's tough. There is just some general knowledge, and so if you have a DM who's going to punish you for knowing to hit the troll with fire, that doesn't sit right with me.
And by the same token, like it's not power gaming to make your highest ability score the most important ability score for your class. I do find that there's definitely DMs that I've encountered in my playstyle where they consider that power gaming. That is, I don't understand. Like, that's not power gaming to me. But we could disagree over that. But I don't think that's
logical character design. That's just using logic. The moment I started D&D, I knew that I should probably put my best stat in the most appropriate place. As we're going along with these surprises from the DM, I think this next point also fits into this category, and that is surprise house rules.
Yeah.
I think that for me, house rules are great. This is, again, why we go back to the very first red flag. Did you have a session 0 to discuss house rules? If you didn't discuss house rules in session 0, and you're playing the game, and you cast a spell, or use an ability, or try to do something that you understand in the game a certain way, and all of a sudden the Dungeon Master says, oh no, we don't, we do that differently here. You roll a 1 on your attack, and you go, oh darn. And then the DM suddenly pulls out the fumble table that you didn't know existed, rolls, and goes, oh, you chopped off your teammate's head, and they have to roll up a new character, and you lose. You're now chaotic evil. Your alignment has changed. And you're just like, what?
Yeah.
How did that happen? I wasn't prepared for that. And to me, that's an extreme example. I'm obviously exaggerating a little bit, but these surprise house rules can be really jarring and really diminish your playing at the table.
I think it can just be as simple as the Dungeon Master ruling that a spell that you thought worked one way works another way. And one perhaps that is counterintuitive to the way that it's presented in the rulebook or otherwise. And this could also extend to like the Dungeon Master sneaking in like abusive tricks with spells. Like, we've talked about that one thing about how Create or Destroy Water doesn't work on monsters. But have you ever encountered a Dungeon Master that tries to cast Create or Destroy Water on the player characters?
Using I would be out of that game so fast if I was a player who knows my opinion of Create or Destroy Water, and I got to a point where my character was killed by Create or Destroy Water. I'd be like, I would have an argument with the DM, and that's not something you want to happen.
Yeah, that's not. But yeah, I think that like surprising house rules coming out of left field, it's one thing. Like always, there's going to be things in the game that surprise you, but the way to manage it, I feel as a Dungeon Master, is to say, I'm surprised by this. I'm going to rule it that it works this way this time, and then after the game we can discuss how it might work in the future. Or what you can do is say, we're going to roll a d6, and on a 4, 5, or 6 it works this way, and on a 1 to 3 it works this way, and then after the session we're going to discuss it. That is, for me, the best way to resolve a rules dispute when it happens in the middle of the game, and not have anyone feel surprised, and having that openness to have that conversation afterwards is really key. I think a lot of the time with these surprise house rules, the essence of what the red flag here is that it signals that this Dungeon Master is going to be inconsistent and potentially unfair in how they make their rulings.
Yeah, and you really need to read the table. Again, some of these red flags might feel different at your table. And an example is I had to learn over several years as a DM to be very forthcoming with the information that I like exploring creative play. I like it when a player comes up with a cool solution, and I like to allow these things at my table. One of my players presented a very interesting way to use Entangle to stop an object that was about to fall through a grate. And they explained it in a weird way that wouldn't exactly work in the way that the spell description works. But I said to them, you know what? I really like what you're going for here, so I'm going to allow it. But if you try to use it this way again in the future, I may not allow it. And I was just very honest because I knew that I was stretching the rules of what the spell could do. But I knew, and I didn't want to open the doorway for them to be able to exploit that later. So I said, right now it's creative and I like it. I don't want it to be exploited, so we'll try to stick to the rules later on. I just like being very forthcoming with this information. But as a new DM, I might not have been. And so surprise rules and rulings can happen, especially if it's a newer DM. But as long as they're being honest and forthcoming and trying to present a good game at the table, and you are getting along and you're working together to learn the game, that's very different than what we're talking about. I think that as we continue, another big red flag for me, which can happen from the DMs or in this case the players as well. If you're joining a new game and you are told which class to play, that is an immediate red flag to me. And this one is actually probably the one I hear most commonly. I've seen this actually on our cleric video where people are saying, hey, I am joining a new game and I'm told that I have to play a cleric, so here I am to learn. And I'm always like, why were you told you had to play a cleric? It's this opinion that, oh, you're joining our party. Well, we don't have a healer yet, so you're going to be the healer. Or we already have a fighter, so you can't play one. D&D is such an open-ended game. Yeah. If you have a champion fighter with a sword and shield and a battle master fighter with a bow, those two players are not going to be playing the same character.
Honestly, I don't even have a problem if two players in my party are playing the same class, subclass, and have the same ability scores. Like, you can make an interesting thing out of that.
Yeah.
Right? You can make it cool for two characters to be playing the same class and subclass, and I think that we have this like weird thing about stepping on each other's toes, or like a social code that says like two players in the group can't play the same class and subclass. No, that's totally fine. Like it doesn't. No one's threatened by that. What's the like party balance? Who cares? Right? Like it really is not. D&D 5e is not like a clockwork, perfectly balanced MMORPG where you have to have like a tank, a healer, and 3 DPS, and otherwise your group just falls apart and can't beat the encounters. Like,
no,
it's not that restrictive. And having the idea, especially of like, or the worst one is when the new player joins the group and is told they have to play a fighter, or they can't play a spellcaster because they're new.
We've gone on record saying that warlocks are one of the hardest classes for new players. My new player picked a warlock, and it's her favorite class in the whole game. She's now tried a few other things, still goes back to warlock being her favorite.
It's fine to make a recommendation, but don't force someone to play a character or a class or an archetype that they don't want to. And this is also where I played in a campaign where like the dungeon master wanted this whole storyline for my character. This was actually in 3rd edition, and the dungeon master told me that my character had to play the homebrew prestige class that they had designed. And I didn't want to do that. Like that wasn't what I wanted for my character. And I was like, actually, I this isn't what I want. Right. And so that's a back and forth that you have to have with one another. But like, if the dungeon master or the players are forcing you to build your character in a certain way or play your character in a certain way, because it can even extend on the other front where you go join a new group and you make your character, and then another player of the group's like, well, actually, I was watching a Dungeon Dudes video and they said that if you are a warlock who doesn't take Eldritch Blast, you suck. And like then is like being controlling over someone else's character build, and it's like, no. And if anyone ever uses that excuse to anybody, like, don't do that.
The Dungeon Dudes are going on record saying whatever choices you've made, they don't suck.
Yeah.
If you're having fun, then you're playing the game right. And that's the most important part. And I also think two things that we need to squash with this that we've said before, but I'm going to say them again. We need to squash these. You don't need a dedicated healer in your party. And clerics aren't the only class that can heal.
Yeah.
Do you have a druid? Do you have a bard? Do you have a
paladin can do the job just fine? Right?
Yeah, paladins are good. Like, there's more than one way to heal, and healing isn't the greatest thing in D&D 5e. And if your DM knows that their party doesn't have a healer, they should be prepared to hand out a few extra health potions, maybe a staff of healing. There are ways. We've played for 3 years in a campaign with no healers, and we're okay.
Another potential red flag is a game master who is not forthcoming about the details of their setting, the adventure, or even the scenario that your characters are in. And by the same token, another red flag can be players who are not forthcoming about their characters and are always like hoarding their secrets and stuff from one another, which, again, all these things can be interesting in the right context. But dungeon masters who are really cagey with information, like you start the campaign and you're all off in a tavern and none of your characters know each other and nobody knows anybody and nobody comes to you telling you what your quest or objective is, and you're all just there in the tavern doing nothing for the entire session trying to figure out what your characters are supposed to be doing. That's not D&D. That's like some sort of weird absurdist hell. And so I think that this can signal a bit of a back and forth of like sometimes dungeon masters feel that they have to withhold information from the group because they want to surprise people, and that the whole reveal of information is the surprise, and that you can't tell people information. We've even seen this really recently where a really common question that we get now since our Drakkenheim adventure came out was dungeon masters asking, should I tell my players about contamination? Should I tell my players about the factions that are in Drakkenheim? And for me, the answer is unequivocally yes. That's an important rule system that the players have to know about, and they need to know that the factions even exist. But I've heard people express that concern of like, isn't that the players knowing too much about the world? Isn't that spoiling things for them in the adventure? And for me, I don't think so. I think that there's a certain measure of information that players need to understand the context for where their adventure actually is. So my rule of thumb, and we've discussed this before, is generally more information is better than not enough.
Yeah, and I think that when I'm building a character, I want to know about the world that I'm going to be setting out in. My goal when I'm building a character is to integrate that character into the world, make them part of it. The more they are part of the world, the more excited I am to experience that world. And if I have a dungeon master who is telling me no information, if I make a character who lives in Waterdeep and then we're playing in Eberron, it's not going to work.
Yeah.
And so I like to have that connective tissue. I like my character design to be a full week-long conversation between Monty and I, where we go back and forth on every way that we can integrate my character in. That is something that I like to do. I realize not everybody does, but without information on the setting, the campaign, the world, the environment, what story I'm going to be taking part in. Oh, we're fighting the Cult of the Dragon. Can I come up with a way that my character cares about what's going on with the Cult of the Dragon? These are important aspects to me. Some DMs might be like, I don't want to tell them about the cult. I want that to be a big surprise. But if you're playing Horde of the Dragon Queen, I feel like it's okay to be like, hey guys, we're playing Horde of the Dragon Queen. You're going to be dealing with a draconic cult.
I feel it's actually one of those things where I've used to see this debate years ago, but I see it less now about should you tell your players that you're running a module for them, that you're running a pre-written adventure for them? And I feel like nowadays we exist in enough of a context where telling your players, yeah, we are playing Curse of Strahd, is kind of necessary to help them avoid spoilers on the internet.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you are worried about spoiling things for players, it can actually be more helpful, especially if you are running a pre-written module, to say we are playing this so they can avoid the real spoilers and whatnot. So again, it's a balance, but I find that if dungeon masters and even other players who are really cagey with information, I find that just creates this weird, I don't understand this world, I don't understand this setting character. And I'm someone that as a player, I like to engage with the world, I like to know about the world, I like to feel like my character lives in the world, and that's where having more information is really...
As we come to this last batch of red flags, the last three are all kind of connected in a way. And they're about sort of the relationship that you have with the people at the table. And the first red flag for me is people who are canceling constantly last minute.
Oof.
Now, the key word here is last minute or unannounced. They just don't show up.
Yeah.
I know that schedules are hard. My group right now hasn't played in a month because there were various life things going on. There were birthdays, there was family, whatever. We haven't played in over a month. We're going to be playing again soon. Schedules happen. It's tough. In my group, we're all adults. We all have lives. It's tough. But what I don't love is if I invited them to the game of D&D. They all said they could make it, and then suddenly one of my players doesn't make it. Obviously, if there was an emergency,
Yes.
if I got a phone call and it's like I had to rush to the hospital for X, Y, or Z, then by all means, I'm not going to be upset. But if somebody just doesn't show up and then they're like, oh, sorry, I forgot, that's a red flag. If somebody continuously, every time that we're about ready to play and the other people are already on their way over, and then I get a text message being like, I can't make it. And it's like, well, this is the third time in a row. Now I have 3 people coming over and one person who just canceled. Red flag.
And this can be one of those problems that you can join a group where you're on time, you show up, the dungeon master's on time, they show up, and then it's 1 or 2 other players in the group. And that's where it just gets super frustrating because it's not the DM. The DM has no control over it. You have no control over it, but you are now affected by another person who is canceling. And I think especially with online groups, we've seen this situation where you just get ghosted by people who just don't show up. And it's really, really hard and it's really, really frustrating. And it might not be a red flag for the dungeon master that you're playing with, but it might be a red flag for the people that are also in that group. And if that's something that just the group dynamic seems tolerant of that sort of thing, you have to decide, is that something that you're tolerant of?
Again, none of these by themselves might be the red flag that breaks it for you. It's really about reading the situation. And I think speaking of reading the situation, as we move on to the next point, which is about the vibe at the table.
Yeah.
And this is one that is hard to quantify, but I can tell you that I have joined a table where I am laughing and getting along with everybody. I've also joined a table where I'm like, I'm not getting along with these people. And it's not that they're necessarily being mean or rude. It's just that we're not clicking. And that might be enough, especially if you have 3 or 4 of these other red flags going on and you're also like, I would not hang out with these people outside of this table. That might be a red flag for you to say, hey, this isn't the right group for me. For me, the big question is, would you hang out with these people? Do you enjoy being in their company? If you don't like these people in any sort of a way, it can affect the entire game of D&D.
You know what it is? It's trust, right? I think for me, one of the most powerful things that should exist between a role-playing game group is trust. Because when the players trust each other, when the players trust the dungeon master, what you are able to do with role-playing games exceeds just dice and farts. You can actually tell interesting stories, do interesting narratives, and you can have a lot more fun with a group of people that you trust if fun is all you want to do with D&D. But as soon as you feel like you can't trust the people that you're around, I feel like you start to lose something of the magic of a role-playing game. It gets diminished a little bit. And so I have difficulty playing D&D with people that I don't feel like I can trust them. You know, if I wouldn't sit down and hang out with you, if I wouldn't trust you like a friend, you know, and it doesn't have to always be the same degree, right? Like there's always degrees of trust in relationships. And sometimes, you know, you have your friends that you're really close with and and are your shoulders to cry on. And sometimes you have your buddies that you play video games and poker with, right? But at all levels of those relationships, there's a certain degree of trust.
I will also say that sometimes you can just tell it's sitting down at a table. We've played several Adventure League games.
Yeah.
And there's some tables that you sit at and you're like, yeah, these people are fun. I can get along with them.
Yeah.
Like we're laughing. We're already cracking jokes. We're bouncing off of each other. The ideas are flowing. Then sometimes you sit down and you're like, I feel weird. Everything's kind of being shut down just a little bit. Nothing's really gelling right. And it's weird because there's so many people that play D&D. You might end up at any number of tables with any number of types of people. And as much as I want everybody to get along with me in the world, not everybody does. And as much as I'd like to get along with everybody in the world, I don't. Yeah. And there's just some times that it's not going to work. But there is an extreme version of this, which is our final red flag that we're going to talk about today, which is unkind, inappropriate, or belligerent behavior towards you or the other players or towards the dungeon master or anybody at the table. This is kind of the extreme version. The vibes can be off and everybody could still be kind and cordial. But to me, this is just an absolute red flag. That
I think this is the deal breaker red flag.
By itself.
Yeah.
If this is the only red flag, it still is a deal breaker to me. If I show up and I had a game where I remember I decided we were about to go into battle. We had snuck up on a group of very small creatures that were hostile to us, but it was going to be a pretty light combat encounter, and we needed to get past them. And I said, I think I'm going to cast Sleep on them. And somebody else at the table went, no, Sleep's a stupid spell. You might not get them all. We're just going to run in. And at first I was like, okay, sure. But as we progressed through more games, I realized that every time I tried to do something, no, that's a stupid idea. No, that's dumb. No, I don't like that. And I started feeling really bad about attempting to try anything at the table. And at first I was just like, okay, yeah, they're just stating their opinion. It's fine. Until I started to realize that they were hurting my feelings and I needed to leave that table.
And it can get a lot worse, as I'm sure anyone who's spent any time reading role-playing game horror stories that are posted on Facebook groups or Reddit can attest to. There's a variety of awful behaviors that you can encounter during a game, and I just want to tell you that if you felt attacked, if you felt like you are extremely uncomfortable by comments or advances or unwanted attention that another player or a dungeon master has visited towards you while you're playing a D&D game that feels like it's stretching outside the bounds of the game as well, when the fiction of the world is no longer a nice barrier and someone is acting aggressively towards you as a person, particularly aggressively towards people in ways that hit at them in a personal or even a threatening way, like if you feel physically or emotionally threatened by someone else's behavior, that's a deal breaker and you should leave that group immediately. I think that kind of behavior is the type of thing that you get one chance to stop it. And if it doesn't stop, get out. And if you're playing with a group that accepts that behavior, that's a big red flag. Like when you join a new group and you sit down and immediately you as a player feel like you are being aggressively targeted by some kind of unkind or unwanted attention or behavior, whether that is comments about your appearance, comments about your play style, whether that is really uncomfortable subject matter being brought up into the game in a way that is unnecessary and that you're not okay with, and no one at the group is saying to that person, hey, maybe dial it back, that's a huge red flag that you just can't trust that you'll be safe in this group. And if you feel like you're not going to be safe, if you feel like your feelings aren't going to be taken into account, if you feel like you can't trust these people, then unfortunately I really think that it's best to get out.
Again, as a closing statement on this, none of these red flags, except maybe that last one, need to stand on their own as a defining factor of you saying, oh, the dungeon dude said I should get out of this game because somebody was late, or there's a few banned spells in this campaign. That's not the point. The point is really, at the end of the day, if you are joining a game and elements of that game are making you uncomfortable or diminishing what you thought was fun about the game, then perhaps it's better to find a different group, even if it's been hard to find a group to play with, and you finally found one, and you sit down and are like, well, I really wanted to play D&D, but man, this is not the D&D I wanted to play, but maybe I should suck it up because I get to roll dice. It might not be worth it. If you've had these experiences and are willing to share, or if there are other major red flags that you've experienced in your games, please let us know about them in the comments below.
There's a lot of great ways to find a D&D group, but one of the ones that I will point out is we have a really cool Patreon community that helps support our channel and make the work that we do here on YouTube possible. As part of the rewards for all of our patrons, we have a private Discord server that is only for our Patreon supporters, and one of the channels on that server is a really amazing Looking for Group channel where a ton of D&D games are formed, new groups play, and a lot of the people on our Discord server have the same sort of values and interest in role-playing games as we do. As they enjoy taking these sort of things seriously. They watch our videos, they watch our content, and we work really hard to foster a positive community there. If you have been having bad luck finding a D&D group, maybe check out our Patreon, talk to some of the other people on our Patreon, and maybe you can find a group through that. I'm not saying that'll happen for sure for everybody. You know, life happens, but that's one thing that you might want to consider trying out, and you can support our work in the process.
And if you want to see us enjoying each other's company and playing some great D&D, you can check out our live play in the Worlds of Drakkenheim, which airs Tuesday evenings on Twitch. You can find all the previous episodes right up over here.
And we got plenty more advice for players and dungeon masters alike right up over here.
Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring that bell so that you're up to date on all of our content.
Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time
In the dungeon.